My name is Stephen Motika.
You are the Program Director at the Poets House in New York.
I am.
Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
Perhaps you could tell me why the literary tourist should visit the Poets House.
Well, Poets House is one of a handful of poetry libraries in the world, and we moved to this beautiful new space about 3.5 years ago, and we have 50,000 volumes of poetry. The collection is special and I think of great interest to bibliophiles because it's an open access, open stack collection, and you're not required to fill out a little pink slip to wait for a book that you're curious to look at. You can just go right to the shelf and pull it off. We not only have books, but we have chapbooks, journals as well, which is something that's a little rare in most libraries. So we have a pretty diverse, eclectic collection. It's an organic collection. It's all donations, so it's not been curated by a whole bunch of librarians. It represents the poetry community and their interests and their passions. So we have some founding books from our founders, including Elizabeth Cray, who was an important arts administrator here in New York, and then the collection of the beloved Stanley Kunitz, our other founder, who was Pulitzer Prize winning, twice poet laureate, who lived to be nearly 101.
So his collection of poetry books or poetry books that he wrote, or both?
Both. We have all of his books of poetry, and we have some interesting translations. You know, we have the various books that he, the translations of his collections into other languages.
Right.
But we also have a lot of his books here, and he was interested in science, so we have some of his science collection, some of his poetry collection. Anything annotated went to Princeton.
I was just about to say,
yeah.
So
unfortunately,
but then again, this, as you've suggested, is more of a reader's library and reading copies, as opposed to anything that might be particularly rare or precious.
Yeah, I mean, there are rare books just by the nature of a poetry book is printed in an edition of 300 or 400 sometimes, and then we get a donation of a book that's 6 years old, and it's rare, de facto rare.
Yeah.
But I would say I think readers' copies is a great way to think of it. We're not really a library for scholars, academics, or professional researchers. We're really a library for people who love poetry. And you could be a reader, a writer, curious. People come on off the park here, walking the Hudson River, and open a book and gaze out at its gorgeous view. Other people are working on manuscripts. Other people are working on serious reviews. Some people just come here for inspiration.
It's just wonderful, though. You can just walk in off the street.
Free and open to the public, and as I said, open access. And the collection is really... It's organized in a friendly manner too, like a living room collection. It's A to Z by author, and no Library of Congress number or Dewey Decimal. It's very sort of familiar, like your books at home. And the anthologies are organized by topic. A book about Emily Dickinson is with her books of poetry, so you just go to one place, and you want to focus on Dickinson, and you would just go to Dickinson on the shelf.
Great.
So.
Okay.
And then we have a show every year called the Poetess Showcase, which is a display of all the poetry books published in the last year. Over 600 American publishers send their books. It's organized alpha by publisher, so it's a really great way to get a sense of what the field is, what's coming out by which publishers. It's very helpful to young and emerging writers because they can see who's publishing books that might be of interest to them or fit their own aesthetics. And then those books are added to the collection. So we actually are keeping up, adding more than 2,000 items a year just of new books. We keep up. That's all donated. We do the requesting, get all that stuff. So our collection is pretty current. And then we're in the process of filling in the back, the older books.
I was going to say, how far back are you trying to go to Beowulf or?
Sure, of course.
I mean, the Iliad.
I mean, our strength and our focus is modern and forward. The last 100 years.
Yeah. Okay.
And some, we have really strong representations in some areas, especially New York.
Yeah.
Poetry in the last 60 years. Anything that would have been in Betty and Stanley's orbit, we have very strong representation. And we have odd cool stuff that, we got because someone discovered who we were and donated a pile of books, and we have them on the shelf.
And by cool stuff, you mean what?
Oh, it could be a quirky, stapled together Mimeo booklet from some San Francisco poet in the mid-'60s, or it could be a poet whom we consider to be central now, an early publication like something they did in college. We have some really beautiful books by presses that came and went by, fine bookmakers or art bookmakers or letterpress printers. We have as I said, the chapbook collection. Sometimes there's some gorgeous things that were in very limited editions that were just made in someone's basement, but are treasures.
So the fine press books would be, again, just as part of the alphabetic listing?
Well, we have the chapbooks are segregated,
yeah.
And then we do have a few rarer items that are in our book processing room in the back room, and the librarian is happy to help anyone. And the really exciting thing is our catalog is now online and searchable anywhere via the World Wide Web. So you could be looking at our catalog in Tempe in advance of a trip to New York and kind of prepare a visit here. And if something is marked rare, you could email us or call us in advance and say, I'm coming from Tempe, Arizona. I would love to see this rarish item, and we would be happy to set you up with that. So that's a new service we provide. And there's a lot of books that exist in our catalog that exist in no other library catalog on the globe. Tiny, tiny little...
because of these chapbooks.
Yeah, a lot of chapbooks are little small presses that came and went, never, we met them at a book fair, we got them into our collection, and they published one book. So it's a treasure. And I think the whole idea behind Poetess being a democratic institution, we collect comprehensively, and at this point we've never deaccessioned anything that we didn't have at least one copy of. So we have some pretty cool self-published stuff. And as you know, self-publishing is a big part of the history of poetry. You could argue Whitman and Dickinson self-published, and we have, I don't know if they'll be considered great poets in 150 years, but we do have some self-published poets who send us all their materials, and I don't think you'll find that in Harvard or New York Public Library or University.
There's usually some kind of, if not snobbish, then certainly there's a filter of sorts, and you're suggesting because of the democratic nature of the mission.
Yes, exactly.
Bring it on.
Yeah. We also have events here, which are great, and if someone's in New York and is interested in coming to a talk or a panel or a reading, they should visit our website, poetshouse.org. Mm-hmm. We have an exhibition right now. We always have exhibitions. Right now the exhibition is dedicated to the work of Alan Kornblum, who
I interviewed about two years ago in Minneapolis. Yeah,
founder of Coffee House Press, and before he founded Coffee House Press, he did this very interesting project called Toothpaste Press, which started as a Mimeo, and then moved to letterpress editions. And you can see in the cases his
evolution.
Evolution. Yeah. And then there's a beautiful wall of broadsides. He used a beautiful broadside printer, and there's a couple dozen broadsides there. Mm-hmm. And then we also have some of our permanent art collection. We have a couple paintings by E.E. Cummings, which are always on view. And then beloved Stanley Kunitz, who's a good friend to Philip Guston. And at Stanley's death, we inherited six Guston pieces. 5 of them are poem pictures, which feature the poetry of Stanley Kunitz with a painting by Guston. And then we have a portrait of Kunitz by Guston. We also have works by Mary Frank, Dara Park, and others up. So that's also something to come see. So if your interest is more on the art side, there's always something to see.
This just popped into my mind, but do you have any Patchen?
Kenneth
Patchen's, because again, he was kind of connecting the two, wasn't he?
We have his books. We don't, unfortunately, have any of his works of art. Yeah. He was a West Coast guy, so we're a little less likely that... Cummings and Patchen are sort of similarly interdisciplinary in that there's a lot of Cummings paintings, there's a lot of Patchen collage and painting and other things. But we hopefully now maybe someone will donate something to us.
Okay.
We don't have an acquisitions budget, so we have to just wait for the winds to blow us these things.
Sure.
But we're always interested, and we're committed, obviously, to books, and certainly committed to works of art, broadsides, and pieces by writer-artists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This annual program that you run, it's such a terrific idea, and if not, it certainly could be replicatable by other others, if not for the entire nation, for their region, I would think. And then just when I come in here, I think that this is something that could be, this is an organization whose genesis is something that could be replicated in cities elsewhere, just again to not memorialize poetry, but to have a place for people who love poetry to show up to participate in, to read, etc.
Sure. There are some other organizations that have spaces of books and whether libraries or bookstores open to the public and have programming. Woodland Pattern, which is a bookstore with programming in Milwaukee, has been around 40 years, and an important part of our organization's history is rooted in conversations with them. Very inspiring place. The University of Arizona in Tucson has their Poetry Center, which is older than Poets House, but for many years was a small house, and now they have a beautiful state-of-the-art facility, sort of like us. They're attached to a university, so it's a little different, but it's still an impressive library, and they do great programs in a beautiful building. And then the Poetry Foundation, in response to their great windfall, decided to also expand a model, I think, based on Poets House and the Poetry Center at Arizona, and create a space, a center. So they have a library and a beautiful exhibition area and an auditorium.
Yes.
So that just opened 2 years ago. And I think in an age it's increasingly digital and online where bookstores are so threatened, and I think these resources, nonprofit resources, to represent, to make visible, and to invite in all walks of life to read books and to hold them and to spend time with them, depositories are really important. So we're not that old an institution. We're 20, I guess this is our 27th year. We're, there are poetry organizations that are much older, but I think the vision of Stanley Kunitz and Elizabeth Cray to create a place for poetry in an increasingly commercialized and expensive and crazed world was really ahead of its time. And I think what you're speaking to is the sort of their vision being born out in reality. And
especially as you say, because of the so many bookstores that are closing, and the fact that there aren't public spaces in which people can just hang out, discuss the books they've read, or learn about what books they should read or might want to read. You are a library, but
we're a non-circulating library,
right? You're not a bookstore, but
we're a library and literary center. And I think that under that rubric we've got the programming arm, which is, akin to a, 92nd Street Y performing arts space, San Francisco Poetry Center. We have education and outreach to children, and we have a children's room, which is very popular, and 14,000 kids came through our doors through class visits last year, all free. We do adult education and classes for poets. We have a wonderful emerging poets program that supports young and emerging writers in finding themselves in their careers. We have exhibitions, so we have a sort of museum-y like gallery side. What else am I missing? We do a lot.
I was going to say that.
So under that rubric, we do a lot of different pieces. We think of our mission as being multi-pronged, all coming though from this place for poetry and our online initiatives too. It's really the core of what we do, is the collection and the place. It's not just a physical place, but the idea of a home for poetry is really at the core.
Just one final question, and that has to do with this idea of enabling others to replicate what you've done. Have you worked with other cities across the country, around the world, that may want to enjoy the same kind of experience that you're offering New Yorkers?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of people that come up to us and say, "Oh, I want to have a poet's house." And
how feasible is that? I mean,
it's hard because it's difficult to fund for something as contemplative and static as poetry books on shelves. Yeah. And the programmatic side interests funders more, but it's very difficult to actually sustain that over the long period of time. I mean, anyone can come out the door and say, "Oh, we're going to have a poetry series," and have a few books on the shelves, but to actually make it work, year in and year out, decade after decade, to pay a staff, to keep the lights on, to keep the floors clean,
So how do you do that?
keep inventing. Well, our staff works on that. That's what we do. I mean, it's the back end. We're raising money. We're coming up with new programs. We're realizing the programs that we've initiated already. We're developing further things that we've been working on for years. Things like the Showcase, for example.
Yes, a great idea where you're able to replenish and update your library at no cost.
Exactly. But we have a staff and a half working on that. That's cost.
Yeah.
And then the database, getting this catalog up online. It actually took the actor Bill Murray giving us seed money a dozen years ago to start this process because no one wanted to fund a catalog. None of the foundations were interested in funding a catalog for a collection of 30,000 books of poetry, at the time 30,000 books. And Bill Murray said, you guys need a catalog. Here's some money to pay someone to get started on that.
And he did a brilliant reading of Wallace Stevens on your website.
Yes.
It's lovely.
He's been very good to us. And it really takes, it takes a village. It's everyone that you come in touch with may help you either on the financial end or through their creative possibility or their community or their passions and interests. And that's part of what we do here is to constantly reinvent and keep alive everything we do. So, for example, the Showcase, we used to do something with the American Libraries Association where a version of the Showcase would travel to their annual conference in Chicago, and we would ship all the books there and have a display, and we did that for a few years. And that was an important way for librarians to see the books. It's kind of before the World Wide Web really, became what it is today. And then that became too expensive. And now we have the web catalog where the thing is available online. And we've moved the Showcase to the summer, and we make it as part of a summer festival where we do a reading series and sort of celebrate being here in this new place, which is that in the summer it's really beautiful down here, and people can come for the afternoon, have a picnic, and stay for a reading because we're in this park-like setting. So it's a constant reinvention and reinterpretation. Same with our outreach to libraries. We do something called Poetry in the Branches, which helps librarians develop poetry collections, readership, and setting up programs in libraries. But that started all in New York Public Library, Queens Public Library, Brooklyn Public Library. And then, they got up and running. The financial landscape changed. Libraries' budgets aren't what they were. And now it's part of a national initiative that we fund through NEH grants and do specific exhibitions and specially focused programming. So we have one on view right now called Muslim Voices. It's about poetry from the Muslim world. And that has programs, a beautiful exhibition, and a website with all this amazing poetry from many languages, but especially from Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. So it's an amazing program, and that is how PITB was reinvented to stay alive. Our own programming here, it has tended to be really focused on conversation and dialogue, so we don't do a straight reading series like many venues, but do events that look at the history of poetry, look at how poets think, read, and understand poetry. So one of our main series is called Passwords, which is poets talking about a poet of influence or import to them. So last week we had Stephen Dobbins talking about the work of James Wright. For our 25th anniversary last year, we did 40-some-odd programs on the history of poetry, starting with Gilgamesh and ending with the Beats, and had poets. Many of them were passwords, some open seminars, some panel discussions, and we moved chronologically, so everything fell into place. And David Ferry was here, just won the National Book Award, sharing his thoughts on Gilgamesh, and we worked our way up through Sanskrit and Chinese poetry, and up to the birth of the sonnet and the rise of lyric poetry in Europe and Great Britain and Shakespeare, and then over to America and basho and haiku, and it was this amazing sequence. But that in itself marked a reinvention and revisioning of what we'd come up with 20 years earlier. So it's constantly, I think, being flexible, but being well grounded, because there's always something that's newer, chicer, faster, and cooler than what you're doing. And those are, the fads come and go, It's like, 5 years ago everyone thought the book would die. Everyone will have an e-reader and books will be dead. And now people think, well, there's still places for books. It's the same thing with the records,
Yeah.
The book is one of the oldest technologies. Poetry is perhaps the oldest art form. I think I think our tenets are solid.
I guess the most important question facing you then is the relevancy of poetry, and this suggestion that whereas 100 years ago it was perhaps as prevalent as television or the internet, now it's very much well, this is the question, not elitist, but poetry being written for the poets versus poetry being written for the public. I imagine you're involved in that debate.
Sure. I mean, I think the role of poetry is different from what was 100 years ago. And, you know, when my grandfather was ill and dying and had no longer memory, a recent conversation, he had a storehouse of poems that he memorized them together.
Carried them around with him.
Exactly. And that was in an age where, you're right, there was no television. He was born before radio was really something prevalent. There was certainly no computing. So the way poetry has rested and represented what its job is, which is that it has an important way of condensing and rendering something that a community, individual culture is going through into a special musical language or a literary language or a poetic language. I don't think we necessarily know where that is. I don't think it's settled down. I don't think the poetry of our time has emerged, how it will exist. So I think it's a period of great excitement.
And
tension. But because of the rise of MFA culture and the ease of book publication, actually, and the internet, there's sort of been a proliferation of poets and poetry. So on the one hand, poetry is maybe a smaller bracket in relation to the general public. But on another hand, poetry itself is greatly expanded. And the number of poets is much larger than it's ever been. So it's part of our participatory age. 90% of Americans think they have a book in them, meaning writing a book. How many people write books for Kindle? In some ways it's very exciting. It's the same thing about everyone being able to play the piano and carry a tune in their dining room. You know, it's different now. People can make music on their computers. You know, they can sample things and create songs that become number one hits. You know, the rules are so different, and I think poetry is as implicated in that as anything, whether it's be the novel or the painting or traditional filmmaking or a play. I think it's all kind of in an up for grabs, shifting mode, and that, yes, it's a time of tumult and possibility, and some things are lost and other things are gained, and I think most people think poetry is in a really exciting mode now, even with all that change. And, you know, Poets House has always been dedicated to the widest definition of poetry. So some people think
democratic,
yeah, some people think hip-hop is the great poetic contribution of the last 30 years. And that's listened to by more people than anything. So maybe it's spoken word and the oral tradition, you know, maybe it isn't right now. Maybe the poem on the page doesn't have the same reach it did 100 years ago, but there will be another page, another kind of page, and another kind of poem that does. So I think it's about that flexibility and that openness to listen and to be aware and to be patient, because all this stuff, you know, in the 4 years we've been here, you know, it's different. Even in the 10 years I've been here, it's different. And the 27 years Poets House has existed, it's changed and will continue.
And just finally, where is here?
Well, we're located in Battery Park City in Lower Manhattan. Our physical address is 10 River Terrace, which is at the corner of Murray and River Terrace. And this part of Battery Park City was built on the fill from the first World Trade Center towers. So in the late 60s it was conceived. And for many years this area was open fill. And then after the towers fell in 2001, there was a real effort to finish the development down here and build out the rest of this part of the landfill and this part of Battery Park City. And that's how we came to be here, because Battery Park City has a pretty progressive vision for nonprofits and non-commercial spaces being included in the urban fabric. So when our building, which is the last residential tower to go into construction, wasn't the last completed, but it was the last to be planned, there was spaces for 3 nonprofits. And we were very fortunate to be invited to apply. We had done programming down here in the early 90s when this area had nothing. So the authority knew us, and we were in a position as institutionally to be able to extend ourselves to raise the money necessary to come down here. And now we have these 11,000 square feet of, you know, we have an incredible view. We have a whole block
It's right on a park, too,
on
as
the
you
Hudson
mentioned.
River in the park, Rockefeller Park. It's really an oasis for people in New York that come down here, and they work for the day. You can bring food and drinks. We have great Wi-Fi. You know, not just the books. We know new technologies are important. So, and then there's a branch of the New York Public Library right across the garden space. So they're here as well. So between us and the NYPL, you can get all your library needs met.
You've just made a great case for literary tourists coming here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.